Hey, welcome to Back in the Dave, and I'm your host, David Knight. And this episode, I scratched up my bass a little bit. This episode, we're going to talk about a style of bass playing that was phenomenal back in the 70s, and it was one of the styles of bass playing that really got me hooked on playing the bass. Way before this style of bass playing came around, I was hooked on the bass playing of James Jamerson and Stanley Clarke and other bass players from back in that time, in the Motown era, obviously in the Stax era, Atlantic Records, all that stuff. But I wasn't playing bass at that time. I didn't really begin to play bass until 1977 when I got my first bass guitar. But there's a style of bass playing that came up around 1976. It was first introduced in 70-71 by Larry Graham and Sly and the Family Stone with their song, Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself. Remember that jam? Oh my God. And this style of bass playing is called thumbing. Some people call it slapping. Some people call it thumping. I think Larry Graham himself, and he was the inventor of it, Larry Graham, I think he actually called it thumping, but it kind of went on to be called, it kind of went on to be called thumbing, at least by the time I got to it in 77, 78, right? So we're going to talk about thumbing a little bit today, and some of the bass players that influenced me playing bass using that style of thumbing. But then I had a very, 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 what's what I'm looking for? Jaw-dropping, inspirational evening one night in 1977 that came full circle for me again in 1983. Okay? And so this episode, we're going to talk about thumbing and my moving into being a professional bass player and thumbing and meeting people. It's just, I don't want to get too far into myself right now. So before I get into this whole story, before I get to this whole thing, I want to first say thank you guys for listening to the show, watching the show, wherever you're getting it from. I really appreciate it. And at the same time, I hope you enjoyed the last episode, Aaron Bionic Brown. Aaron and I go back years, actually a couple of decades. He and I go back. He's a really great guitarist, jazz musician, arranger, composer, studio owner. I hope you liked the episode. He himself said, he called me and said, hey, Dave, man, I watched the episode and it literally brought me to tears because you got my story. The essence, the core of my story, you got in the show. And I was like, really? He goes, yeah, like you really did. I was like, okay. And that's my goal with Back in the Dave now. You know, when I do interviews, I really want to bring out whoever I'm interviewing. I want to bring out their story, how they got into music back in those days, back in those very crazy, inspirational, creative days of being a young musician back in the 60s or 70s. Aaron's got several years over me, so he was like back in the 60s when I was still trying to figure out who the hell David Knight was. He was playing and doing his thing because he's got several years on me. Okay, so for him, the 60s and the 70s, for me, the 70s and moving into the 80s. Okay, and that's the goal with the show. You know, really bringing music more into it. We're going to definitely do that today, and that's why I want to talk about thumbing. Okay, so thank you so much, first of all, Aaron, for being willing to come on the show. And for those who have made the suggestion, it's going to be done. It's actually in the works we're talking about. I know, Mike Roselle, you asked about Aaron and I doing a collaboration together, and we are going to do that. We've already had the discussion, and at this point, it's just a matter of songs and getting together and me grabbing my bass and going to his studio or him coming to my studio, and we're doing it, putting it together. And once we start doing that, I really like to get some video of it as we're working on it and put it out there for all you guys to see, and also edit it into some of the podcast episodes as well. So those folks who watch Back in the Day on YouTube can see some of the behind the scenes things that we're doing as well. All right. So let's move into this episode. I'm going to call it thumbing. So for those of us who know and who lived it and who were there, disco was all the rave back in the throughout the 70s and early 80s. I mean, it just took over the whole damn decade, right? It was literally Disco Mania, Discotheques and Excess Celeste, and all of this stuff in Cerrone, Supernature. You know, remember all those jams? I mean, Spring Rain, all of these songs and the big orchestrations. It was disco, disco, disco. And what it did is disco kind of took soul and R&B off the plate, because disco came with that boom, 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 boom. Remember that? Michael Zegler, Let's All Chant, boom, 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 that whole thing, right? So disco came and took over. From my understanding, club and disco, the song The Love I Lost by Howard Melvin and the Blue Notes, I think that song has been pinned as the song that started the whole disco and or club craze back in those days, right? But while disco was going crazy and was going totally mad and just chic with dance, 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 and they want everybody dancing, Good Times and La Freak and all those tunes, as disco began spinning up more and more and more and more, there was another style of music coming up right under it. And at certain points, they kind of merged together. And that other style of playing was funk. It's like the funk of soul, James Brown soul, Sly and the Family Stone soul, all that soul stuff kind of changed. But what made it change to me, the groove for the drums kind of stayed there. What made it change for me was the bass. Because it went from being like just regular kind of James Jamerson, that kind of playing, to popping, to thumbing, you know. It went more into that. And so what happened is that you had this merge between disco and funk coming along, especially towards the late 70s with songs like Boogie Oogie Oogie. Everybody called Boogie Oogie Oogie a disco song because it had that boom, boom. But it really wasn't. It was really a dance, funk / disco kind of song. And what made the difference was the bass, because they're doing... That's funk. And that's the difference. Even though she wasn't... Even though she wasn't playing it that way, it was still funk. Okay? So you had this thing called thumbing, which that was just popping strings. That kind of stuff. You had that going on. Okay? Which turned, to me, that turned soul and James Brown kind of funk into a more nastier, grittier, dirtier type of music style. And that's when I was coming along. So 1976, 1977, you have the Brothers Johnson coming in 1976 with Louis Johnson, okay, one of my idols. I mean, I keep on, I don't know why the hell I'm putting my bass down because I keep coming back to it. But you have Louis Johnson, one of my idols, and Louis, he came with like, Get the Funk Out My Face, you know. You know, he had that going on, but then they did a whole big dance version of Get the Funk Out My Face, all right, which just brought in his whole solo and everything behind that, which was... And I wanted to learn that song so bad. But the musicians in my neighborhood at that time, the guitar players, they were just that. They were guitar players. They really weren't bass players. They were guitar players that played a little bit of bass. I wanted to be a bass player, right? So they would come to my house, come up into my bedroom, and they would look at my bass. Oh, Dave, man, nice bass guitar. It's all good. And they sit there and they'll play it back and forth, and they'll play the little things. But they played it like a guitar, right? They played it like a guitar. I didn't want that. And I wanted to know how to thumb. So they would say, well, here's what you do, Dave. And remind, these guys are maybe about a year or two older than me. So this is 1976, 77. So I was like 14, 15 years old. They're like 17, maybe 18 years old, right? And they're like, well, you do this and you... And they're showing me some stuff and they're just kind of heavy-handed on it. I'm like, okay. And I'd go home and when they'd leave and I would, sit there on my bed and I would... But it wasn't grooving. It just wasn't there. And I practiced and I practiced and I practiced and it was still very... I was popping strings, stuff like that, but I still wasn't getting the essence of what I was hearing on records. For example, another one of my idols, Mark Adams from Slave. You got Slide. And I wanted to play that song so bad, and I knew how to play it, but not the way Mark Adams knew how to play it. And I would practice and try to get it, and it was kind of flaky here and there. So it was frustrating for me, very frustrating, because I really wanted to learn that style and was so heavy-handed and so out of sync and just really didn't understand it that well that I just okay, I don't know. But then something happened in 1978, and now I'm going to put my bass down because I want to tell this little story. But something happened in 1978 that changed the whole game for me. It changed everything. So in 78, my older brother Anthony, he and I by this time were going to the same school, Benjamin Cardoza in Bayside, Queens. And one night he says, "Hey Dave, I'm going to a show at the Right Track End." And this was a nightclub on the corner of Hempstead Turnpike and Springfield Boulevard in Queens, New York, right? And I would always pass that nightclub on the bus, in the 77 bus, going back and forth from school and stuff like that. And I would wonder what it was like going in there, if I had a band playing and all that kind of stuff. Well, one of my brother's friends he and I both went to high school. I think her name may have been Natalie, but I don't remember what her name. I think it was Natalie for some reason, but I don't remember. She was a singer, and she was in a band. And my brother was going to see their band rehearse one night at the Right Track End nightclub. Well, it was more like a bar tavern in my opinion, but they had a gig there. The band that she was in had a gig there. And he said, "Hey Dave, I'm going to see, I'll say Natalie, I'm going to see Natalie playing her band. You want to come?" And I got to give my brother credit, because by the time, let me just take a little side note here. I got to give because my brother and I, my older brother Anthony and I, we didn't get along a hell of a whole lot very well when we were kids. He was always like, "Don't touch me. Stop touching me." He was like that. "Leave me alone. Don't put your head on my walls in my room. Get out of my room. Leave my record." He was like that. But he wasn't trying to hear that. He wasn't trying to be the big brother that I so wanted back in those days. He was trying to do his own thing, which now I understand, but back then I didn't get. But for my older brother to say, "Hey, I'm going to see a friend of mine from school playing a band," he knew how much I loved music by now. He knew I was into my music, and he did so many things to help expose me to other people who were into my music as well. The episode, perfect example, the episode that I did with Julio Herrera back in January, that episode, I met Julio through my brother in school. That was how I met him. And as I talk about MU1 and Clayton and all those people, that all that stuff came through my brother introducing me to people who he knew in high school, because he was in that school a year before I was. Those were the people that he introduced me to that spun into other things. And I tell these stories, but quite frankly, had it not been for my older brother introducing me to these people, I would have never known. And this follows suit with that. Okay, but this helped in a tremendous way that he doesn't even know. And I guess if he listens and watches this episode, he'll find out then, or I'll call him and tell him, "Yo, Anthony, I forgot to tell you, let me tell you this." Anyway, so he said, "You want to go?" I'm like, "Yeah, hell yeah, I want to go, So this is like 1978. So 78, I'm 16. My brother, at the time, he was 17. He's a year older than me. And we go to this show to see his friend again. I think her name was Natalie, so I'm going to call her Natalie, because I think that's what her name was. I don't remember. I'll find out from him maybe. We went to see her band play. And they had a pretty big band. Keyboards, bass player, guitar player, a couple of different singers, a horn section. I mean, it was like a little Earth, Wind & Fire. Okay, and I was just sitting there and just like, wow, okay. And they're playing, and they did a song that I love. There was this song, this band back in the 70s called El Coco. They had a song, an instrumental called "Let's Get It Together." And this band played that song, "Let's Get It Together," just like the record, and my jaw dropped. I love that song, "Let's Get It Together," so much that I'm seriously considering doing it over again and covering that song. That's how much I loved it. But when this band did it that night in '78, they did it just like the records. The keyboard solo, the horn parts, the bass, the funk, the everything. I was just sitting there in the chair like, whoa. And then they played Ain't We Funkin' Now by the Brothers Johnson. That was their big hit, their big release in 1978, and this local band covered it. And once again, it sounded just like the record. But now my eyes are on the bass player, because all the other songs, he's just playing bass. He's just in the pocket, just grooving. I'm like, he's doing nice stuff. I'm like, yeah, he's nice, he's good. It's all good. He was leaps and bounds ahead of me in terms of playing bass. He had been playing for years, maybe even 10, 15 years. You know, he was also older than me, okay? So he was just a better rounded, more polished bass player. But what I learned that night in that club, watching that band play and then watching him play bass, when they did Ain't We Funkin' Now, and he played Louis Johnson's parts just as nasty as Louis Johnson played them. At least that's my interpretation of it now. At the time, again, me being 16, that was my interpretation of it. That he may not have, but it damn sure sounded like it and looked like it, and it wasn't the record. That's how it came across to me. I was floored. I was like, oh my God, he plays like Louis. Now, by this time, Louis Johnson was my idol. So I tried playing everything that I could, as all bass players did back in that time. Louis Johnson was like, yo, he was the teacher. There was several, of course. There was Louis Johnson. If you're in the jazz fusion, Stanley Clarke. Stanley Clarke is a monster to this very day. A monster bass player. Just like, damn. So all those bass players you see out there doing all this kind of stuff and playing really fast and riffs and scales and up all that, they got that from Stanley Clarke. Period. Let's keep it real, keep it honest. That was Stanley Clarke. He was the one that did all that. So I was into Clarke, but I was really into Louis Johnson. And for this bass player, I don't remember his name. We're going to say his name was Louis. Here you go. I didn't give much thought to that one now, did I? No, I really didn't. Okay. So we're going to say Little Louis, who played in this band that night, he played that just like Louis Johnson, right? My jaw dropped. I was floored. I was shocked. And all I know is I wanted to play like him. I wanted to get to that level of thumbing. I still couldn't do it. After a year of playing, I still didn't have the chops down. So when their set was over, the night was over, my brother got up and he went to talk to his friend. I'm going to say Natalie again. I don't remember her name. Talked to her and other band members. I got up and I hauled my ass right over to the bass player. Hey man, my name is David. And he was playing, if I remember correctly, a white Stingray bass, a white Music Man Stingray bass. And I wanted a Stingray bass so bad back in those days, because that was the bass, that was one of the basses that Louis Johnson was playing, was the Stingray, the Music Man Stingray bass. And he had one. And I was like, oh my God, he is living my dream, man. He's living my dream. So in order for me to get a piece of that dream, I had to talk to him. I was very shy back in those days, talking to anybody, especially girls, but anybody, I was very shy. But I found the courage to walk up to him and say, hey, Mr. Bass Player, or Little Louis, how do you play like that? How did you learn to play the bass like that? Because you sound and play like Louis Johnson, and that's how I want to play. He said, hey man, how you doing? I was like, I'm doing good. I'm like, but how do you do that? He said, well, let me show you. So he picked up his bass, like I'm doing now, right? He said, what you do, man, is, see if I got my levels up. Yep, they up. He said, what you do is you practice with your thumb. He goes, do you practice your scales? I said, yeah, I practice my scales. He says, okay, so do your scales with your thumb. So instead of doing your scales like this, do them like this. and I messed up. And you practice your scales like that. Start off slow. Minor scales. Use your thumb. Practice it with your thumb and the metronome. Start off slow, go very slow, and as you get better and better with it, okay, go faster and faster and faster. I said, that's it? He goes, yeah. I'm like, okay. Well, seemed easy enough to me, but I still didn't make the connection. How do you go from doing this to doing this? You know, I couldn't make those connections. But because he plays so well, and because he plays so much like Louis Johnson, I said, you know what, Dave, just go home and do what he says. So I did that. I went home and I began practicing my scales using my thumb and just doing my scales, arpeggios, everything using my thumb. But he also said something that night that stuck with me. He said it's also in the wrist. You know, it's in your wrist. Your wrist needs to be smooth. It needs to be flexible. It needs to just be fluid and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know if he used those words, but those are the words that I know to use now to get that point across. So if I was to another bass player who's just learning, those are words that I would be using now. I'm sure he didn't use those words back in those days. But anyway, back to our story. He said, you know, it's in your wrist also. It's in your wrist. But just do those scales with the metronome and in your wrist and build up the strength in your wrist and your fingers and your thumb, and you'll see it'll come. So I did that. But I also did something a little bit different because my first instrument was not bass. My first instrument was drums. So I had drumsticks in the house. I had an old drum kit that my parents bought me when I was like 9 years old, you know, and I had a drum pad in my house. And I said, oh, wait a minute. He said, build up your wrist. So I went back and I grabbed my drumsticks, and instead of using my drum pad, I went to my pillow. I like flat, dead. I don't like fluffy pillows that keep your head up. I like dead, flat pillows. And I had a dead flat, what I call a dead flat pillow. And I took that pillow, and when my parents made me turn my bass off at night, I would take my pillow, put it on my bed, take my drumsticks, and practice my drum rudiments. Left, right, left, left, right, left, left, right, left, right, right. Paradiddles, all these different things with my old drum rudiments, but just using my wrist. Just using my wrist, because I knew that that would build up my wrist. But both of my wrists, it would build it up. And so I began practicing my drum rudiments on a pillow. I used the pillow because I wanted it to be dead. Hopefully it would give more strength or more resistance, you know, in my wrist. This is how I'm thinking. I mean, like, I'm 16 years old, so I don't know. You know, this is how I'm thinking. And so when I'm playing like this, playing like that. And over time, doing that with the drumsticks and practicing my scales with my thumb, and then practicing up against the records and listening close to what Louis Johnson was playing, Larry Graham, Stanley Clarke, Mark Adams, all these different bass players and what they were playing and how they approached funk bass playing in the mid to late 70s, I began to get it. I'm like, oh, I get this. And so it was still kind of quirky throughout the 70s and stuff like that, and, you know, all that kind of stuff, and throughout high school. But then high school was over in 1980. So now we fast forward 1980. I'm 18 years old. But now it's different, because now, as I lovely pick up my guitar one more again, now I get it. So now I have most of the rhythm. Now I have most of the rhythm in here. So now I'm more like. I should take off my ring because my ring is really in the way. My wife and I got new wedding bands, and this one's kind of big and it kind of gets in the way of my playing now. But so I got funky with it. You know, I really got better. I was writing songs by now, blah, blah, blah. All those things came into being as my bass playing got better. So now let's jump a couple of years from 1980, 1983. 1983, my band Chase is together. We have songs going off, What You Gonna Do For Me, and these are funk dance songs, bass-driven, bass-driven funk dance songs, right? In 1983, the Chase Story podcast episodes are coming up in the very near future, before the end of this year. They're long and working at them, but they're coming up. But I'll say this, Chase, we were not trying to be a wedding band. We were not trying to be a local school band and stuff like that. We wanted to be recording artists and a touring band on tour with some of the major acts that were out there at the time. Okay, open up for Prince, open up for the Jacksons. This is where our minds were. This is where we were trying to go at that time, until everything imploded. And you'll hear those deep stories on the Chase episodes as they come out, right? But I felt that we should still be playing and doing some live stuff at the time. And what happened, most of us went to Five Towns College of Music out in Seaford, Merrick, Long Island at the time. Now they're in, I think they're still in Seaford or Belmore, I forgot now, but they're still out there in Long Island, right? And the school was doing a Battle of the Band contest. And I thought that Chase, with our new songs going off and What You're Gonna Do For Me, I felt that Chase should be in the Battle of the Band contest, okay? We had been rehearsing these songs. We knew them like the back of our hands. We had a producer at the time. We didn't have a manager at the time yet. No, we did actually, but we had a producer at the same time. Our producer came to the show. We agreed to do the show. Producer came to the show. Our manager did not, because he was busy doing other things. These stories, these backstories I haven't said yet, but we did the show. We got into the show. I grabbed one of our friends, Eric Sadler, and for those who don't know, Eric went on to be a co-producer with Public Enemy, working with them, producing and writing a lot of their songs back at that time as well. But Eric and another friend of ours, Charles Cassius, they had a rehearsal studio, and we used to rehearse down there. They had all this gear and stuff. So we asked them if we can use some of the gear, and if Eric could come out with us to the show to help us out with the show. We had put together a whole show with choreography and sound effects. I mean, we really wanted this to be like, we were like Little Earth, Wind and Fire, Little Chic, playing at Nassau Coliseum or Madison Square Garden someplace, right? And we had put this whole thing together. So Eric said, yeah, I'll come out, I'll do it. He helped us out. We got the gear out there, set up everything, got everything going. We were like, I think, the second to last band to go on. And, like I said, we had these two songs, What You Gonna Do For Me and Going Off. These are two songs that I came up with on the edge of my bed at home. And again, when I tell the Chase stories, you're going to hear a lot more about these songs and how they came to be. But long story short, one of the bass lines for, let's say, Going Off is, again, it's funky. It's like, mess up my own songs now. Here we go. Okay, that was the bass line, the primary bass line for Going Off. All right, funky as hell, man. I'll tell a story of how that song came along in the Chase episodes. But so we did those two songs, Going Off and What You Gonna Do For Me. It was, to say the least, a very energetic set. The crowd was going crazy, all right? And as the crowd was going crazy, there was a gentleman, put my bass down again here, get back to the story. There was a gentleman in the front seat. He's losing his mind watching us perform. We're jumping in and out of dance routines. We didn't like any of us, so let me go back for a minute. There are certain bands, if you go to see live shows, live concerts, you'll see certain bands Well, they'll put up their hands to give certain cues and certain this, and okay, here we go. We're gonna do this. We didn't want no cues. We wanted to execute our show with no cues. We didn't want anybody to see our hands go up to wave the band to stop or to go into a change it. We didn't want none of that happening. So we use what I call now silent cues. So if the drummer did a drum roll, that would cue us into maybe a different dance step. If I did something specific on my bass at a certain time in the song, that would cue us to go into maybe a bridge or a turnaround or something different. So the audience never saw us wave hands or anything like that. We're just jumping in and out of songs and in and out of dance routines and performing, and it was insane, totally insane. One of the best nights of my life. Okay, and but there's this guy in the front row, and he's going crazy. He's like losing his mind. He's like, oh my God. He has his hands over his mouth. And he's pointing to the stage and everything. And we went out and bought costumes, outfits. I mean, again, we were trying to be like Earth, Wind & Fire with the Commodores, because that's how we were thinking at that time. That's the level that we want to be on at that time, right? So he's tripping. He's in the front row seat, just really ecstatic, just going like, oh my God, but he's pointing at me. He's pointing at me. He's like, he's got his hand up over his mouth again, and he's slouching in the seat, almost falling off the chair and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, this dude's kind of bugging. What I'm thinking, oh, Insecure Dave, I'm thinking he's laughing at my bass playing because I suck. This is what I'm thinking. I'm like, hey, So I'm like watching him saying, F you, man, I don't give a damn. Whatever you think, it's whatever, right? I don't care. But I'm still watching at the corner of my eye as I'm jumping in and out of dance steps and choreography and, different cues and stuff like that, and just trying to give the best show that I can give, even though this cat in the front row seat sitting right below me is pointing. He, to me, in my mind, when you have a comedian and there's a guy in the audience, who's just a haggler. To me, he was that to me. He was like a haggler, just paying in my ass at that time. And again, this is like 1983. This was May of 1983. So I was still 20 years old. I was still a couple of months from turning 21. I was just a baby, right? So he's doing all that. But at the end of the second set, the end of the second song, what you're gonna do for me, we closed the show. We all turned around. Eric came back on stage and put the music back up, and then we walked off in a very military style, step dance type style. We walked off stage. Crowd freaked the hell out, bugged the hell out. I was like, yeah. We get to the back. Can't call it a green room, can't call it a dressing room, because this was a club called Rum Runners at the time, which may even still be out there I think it was in Bayshore, Long Island. And so we go in the back room. As the old story, the floor is sticky and the sawdust and all that kind of crap. It was that type of a joint, right? And but the crowd was going crazy. But then the next band came in. But then I'm talking to Tracy, and as I'm talking to her, something very interesting happened that I have not forgotten to this day. I'm talking to her. We're all excited about the show. And somebody taps me on the shoulder. Hey, man. I turn around. I'm like, hey, what's up? But now I recognize the guy. This is the guy sitting below me in the front seat, laughing with his hand over his mouth, laughing and stuff like that, pointing his finger at me. So I'm saying to myself, I copped an attitude. I'm saying to myself, like, yo, you don't leave me alone, cat. Like, what's your problem? Like, back up off me. Back up off me. BACKUP off of me. If you don't like my bass playing, why you all in my grill? Now, these are things that are going through my head at that time. Not quite as I expressed them just now, but those are things that are kind of going in my head at that time, because that's how I felt. Get the funk out my face. Leave me alone. But then I kept looking at him. But he's saying, yo, man, you are the cat. You are the joint. You are this. You are a nasty bass player. And I was like, oh, word? He was going off like that in his chair because he was like amazed at my bass playing. I'm like, whoa, okay. I guess I was wrong. I guess maybe I don't suck. Even though I still think I suck. But we'll get into my insecurities later on, right? But he's going off all the accolades, all the kind words, all the gestures, giving five, slapping five, high fives, low fives. Yo, man, like that. He's like, well, those songs were hot, man. Those bass lines. I'm like, yo, those are my bass lines. Those are your bass lines? Yeah, those are my bass lines, man. He's like, dude, those are hot bass lines. Oh my God. I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, man. Now it's ego time for me because I know that those are hot bass lines. Going off, what you're going to do for me, other songs like Dancing, Reaching, these are all, y'all going to hear all these songs when I do the Chase episodes. These were hot ass bass lines. I knew that. I kept it cool, but now I'm like, yeah, I'm the man. I know, it's all good, right? And he's going on and going off. And as he's talking, I'm saying to myself, where I know this guy from? I know him somewhere. Where the hell? Where I know this guy from? And then it clicked. Bam. Oh my God. This is the bass player from 1978 when I went to see their band and I was like 15. I was still 15 years old. And my brother took me to the nightclub, the right track in, to watch his friend play in the band. That was that bass player from that night. And when that clicked in my head, I was like, oh shit. Oh, now he's telling me all this stuff. Table turned a little bit. So I'm listening to him now, and Dave Knight, ego man dropped. Everything dropped, and I just became like real cool, real humble, because now I'm like, yo, this is mentor right here. This is the man right here. This to me is a nasty bass player. I remember him from 1978. This is the guy that got me on. Wasn't for this guy, what he saw tonight wouldn't really be happening like that, because it's what he taught me that night as to how I got to where I did as a bass player. So I looked at him, I said, well, I'll use for the show here, Little Lewis. I said, do you remember me? So he looked at me real close, real good. Nah, man, nah, I don't. I said, you don't remember me? He goes, nah, I really don't, man. He said, we met before? I said, yeah, we met back in 78. He goes, 78? I said, yeah, man. I said, you were playing at this club called the Right Track Inn in Queens on the corner of Hempstead Boulevard and Springfield Boulevard. Hempstead Turnpike and Springfield Boulevard. Oh, I remember that gig. Yeah. I was like, that's where we met. He goes, wait, you were that little dude that walked up to me asking me how I play like that? I was like, that was me. He goes, really? I said, yeah, man. I said, you told me that night to practice my scales using my thumb and with the metronome, and just do that and start out slow. And then as time went on, as you get better at it, go faster and faster and faster. He said, yeah, I remember telling you that. Yeah, okay. So I went home and I did that. So he goes, well, obviously you did. I said, yeah, man. I went home and I did that. I said, but I was also a BS drummer back when I was a kid, and I would just do drum rudiments also, because you said that night to build up my wrist and my endurance. And I realized as I began playing that my wrist would get tired when I was strumming. It would get tired. And when my wrist got tired, that I needed the endurance. I needed to keep on going. So I said I began practicing my old drum rudiments, paradiddles, left, right, left, right, left, right, right. I began practicing my paradiddles and stuff to make my wrist stronger, and hopefully to also have more speed in my wrist. He said, dude, you achieved it all. He said, when you played tonight, he said, you were playing accurate, on punch, funky as hell, in the pocket with the drummer, and at the same time you were singing and jumping in and out of dance routines. I was like, well, yeah, that's what you're supposed to do. He goes, not everybody can do that. I'm like, well, everybody. You ever see Louis Johnson do that? I was like, nah, I can't say I have. Can't say I have. You ever see Larry Graham do that? Can't say I have. He goes, you were doing that. You were playing precision bass, point playing right? Funky as hell, didn't lose the groove, in the pocket, dance songs, and you're jumping in and out of dance routines and playing your bass with that kind of speed, that kind of precision, and at the same time, in and out of dance routines and singing lead and background vocals. I'm like, well, yeah, I guess so. He goes, man, you're amazing. Now, you know, I appreciate all that. And he's right. I was doing all that stuff back in those days. But I did all those things not trying to be, you know, some cool, hot, new bass player can kind of do it all and play bass and dance and blah. I did it because I thought that's what everybody else was doing. So I thought everybody else was doing what the hell I was doing. And I was like the low guy on the pole because I'm coming to the party late. Well, quite frankly, I never got to the goddamn party. But we're getting there now. That's all that really matters, right? And so, but when he pointed it out to me, he said, look at the other cats, man. They're not doing that. You know, Bernard Edwards, the bass player from Chic, nasty. He wasn't, God bless him. He's gone now. But a nasty bass player. But you didn't see him jumping in and out of dance routines and high impact performances and shows and stuff like that, you know. When Chic performed, Chic stood on stage, they stood still, you close your eyes and it's jamming. But the show's like, okay, we're just kind of standing there, not doing a hell of a whole lot. People complained about that back in the day. I don't know if they knew that or not, but they did. But anyway, people still came to the shows, and that's all that really mattered. That's really all that mattered, right? I was so honored and so humbled by what he was saying, because for a moment, I did not remember him, and he did not remember me. It wasn't until it clicked in my head, I said, oh, I think I know this guy. And I called him by his name. He said, yeah, how you know my name? I said, because that club in 1978, I was there. I was that kid that asked you, how do you do that? How do you play like that? And he goes, yeah, man. He said, I showed you that? I said, yeah, you did. He goes, I remember. And I was so humbled that night. I went home that night with such a full heart. You know, it's kind of weird because it's different, because as musicians and artists, getting validated by fans is so important. You want your fans to love your music. You want your fans to love you. You want your fans to love your bass playing, your piano playing, or whatever it is you do. You want the fans, the people, to love it. And that's how I am to this very day. People who buy my music, I ain't got a hell of a whole lot out right now, more coming. But people who follow me, who are into what I'm doing, the people, that matters most. But at the same time, when you have a colleague, especially a colleague that plays the same instrument that you play, and he or she walked up to you and goes, yo, give me 5, man. You nice. You're nice. That puts so much, a different type of validation, because when you're young playing, you want to be, especially from back in those days, if you're a bass player, you wanted to be like Larry Graham or Stanley Clarke, you know, or Louis Johnson or Bernard Edwards or Jaco Pastorius or James Jamerson, the bass player for Motown. You know, you wanted to be among those guys because they were good players and they played on music that was phenomenal, that the whole world loved. And that's what us musicians in a nutshell try to do. We want to be the best musician that we can be, best songwriters, and get our music out there for the people to love. But it's special. It's a different type of special when your colleague walks up to you and says, you did good. Especially someone who was what I'm going to call a passing teacher. He was a passing teacher. He just was in passing. That one night in 1978 was just a passing teacher. I asked him how he did that, and he showed me. All the other guitar players and quasi bass players in my neighborhood at that time for a whole year tried to teach me how to thumb, how to play that bass and thumb. And I couldn't figure it out, what they were teaching me. But he said, do this. And when he said do that, something in me clicked, and I did that, and it worked. And it led me to the next level of bass playing. Now, I have to admit, 50 some odd years later, I'm really rusty on my bass. And so I no longer really consider myself a bass player any longer. I got some chops. I play good enough to play on my songs. But at this point, I'm a composer, producer, songwriter. And that's my thing. Meaning, if I write a song and I sit down with my bass and I can't get that bass part out and it doesn't sound right for the song, I'm going to call in another bass player to play that bass part, even though I'm a bass player. And even though I can hold my own on my own music and my own songs and other stuff as well, as a bass player, I would still call in another bass player to play the part. If I can't get it on my guitar, I'll try doing it first on my own. If I can't, I'm calling somebody else in. You go back 30, 40 years ago, I ain't calling nobody in. I'm a bass player. I'm the man. I can play. This is my song. I wrote the song, and you're going to hear those stories, and you're going to hear about that in the Chase episodes when they come up. I got into many arguments with our producer at the time. I wrote these goddamn bass lines. How are you going to play the bass line? So I got into that kind of stuff, but you hear those later. But that I wouldn't have dreamed of it. I would have sat down till I got those bass parts for that song right. Ain't nobody playing bass except David Knight on these songs. That's it. We grow, we mature. We become adults, right? We become adults at the end of the day. So I will never forget that night. I will never forget him. The confidence that night gave me on stage, and the confidence that was added to it when he came behind stage to show me some love. Out of that whole night, only one picture was taken. And if you go to the website, davidknight.com/thumbing, you'll see one picture. It's blurry. It's a side shot. It's a great action shot. But unfortunately, only one picture was taken from that night in '83. But I think the picture kind of gives you an idea of how electric Chase was on stage that night and what we did and how we all went home shocked at our performance, shocked at how we played on stage, the five of us. It was, for us, at that time, I was 20, going on 21. I mean, 1983, Tracy was still, she wasn't even 19 yet because she didn't turn 19 until the following month of '83. She turned 19 in June of '83. This Battle of the Band happened in May of '83, so she was still 18. So when I tell some of these stories, and again, I go and say it again, you'll hear more of it in Chase. The fact that we never made it to mainstream is unfortunate because it was a hell of a band. It was really a hell of a band. Really, really was. But that's going to wrap it up for this episode. All right. And I'm going to pick up my funk machine over here a little bit. Put a little bit more of make sure it's all right. Put a little bit more going off. I can't wait to tell a story about Going Off and you guys hear some of the songs, and I am so waiting for the Chase episodes, man, because I have it all on cassette tape. That's why it's going to take so long, because I'm going to be taking the rehearsals and the behind all this stuff. It's all going to be in audio because we were all teenagers in our early 20s, so nobody could afford a camcorder back then. Not us, not. We were all living at home with mommy and daddy at the time, right? So a little bit of Going Off. So thanks for tuning in, folks. I appreciate it very much. Catch up with me on Facebook, davidknightcompose.com, and here on YouTube. And again, back in the Dave episodes on iTunes and on Stitcher as well. And I need to I haven't checked it. I've been so daggone busy. Should be on iHeart, should be on Spotify as well. If anybody's trying to watch on anything other than iTunes and Stitcher and TuneIn Radio, and it's not coming up, if you're searching, it's not coming up, let me know. I haven't had the chance to really dig in and see what's happening, and I need to, but I'm still in my healing mode and all that kind of stuff right now, so I'm not on my game as I should be. But as I move forward, I'm getting back in the game slowly, but I hate using that term game. I'm getting back into Davey D, Dave the Dope Fiend, doing my thing, right? I'm getting back into it. So let me know. But catch up with me, all the back episodes as well. Sign up for the email list, because as I start getting back into everything, email is going to be my thing. It's going to become more and more intimate between myself and all of you. It's going to become more and more intimate, and email is going to be the way I do it as well. Okay, so thanks for hanging with me. Thanks for listening to this episode. I really appreciate it. And as my grandmother would say, keep on living. Night out.